Regardless of whether you follow politics, you've almost certainly heard of the Chequers Brexit deal and all the controversy surrounding it, but what does the deal actually entail? Last week, Prime Minister Theresa May met with her cabinet in Chequers for a marathon 12-hour meeting session where they discussed their plans for the white paper for an agreement for the future of the relationship between the UK and the EU. And the plan was to create a Brexit vision, a Brexit plan that the EU would accept. And while Brexiteers like Boris Johnson initially rejected it, they eventually fell in line and May put forward a proposal to the British people. I mean, Boris Johnson at first said to the Chequers cabinet meeting that they couldn't polish a turd, but he fell in line. But since then, he's resigned, and David Davis has resigned as well. He's the Brexit minister, and he said we were just giving away too much too easily. But what is this Brexit plan? Now, I wanted to just break this down as simply as possible, because we know what politicians are like. With politician talk, they'll say one thing, mean another. They can all stand up in the Commons and say that we want a Brexit deal that works for this country. But what does that mean, you know? Everyone says, oh, we want it in the best interests of our country, but you never know what they're actually talking about. Now, there's about 12 points in this white paper, this plan, but I wanted to break it down in just a handful of really main points, just to nail home the fact here that actually this isn't a Brexit. So first off, let's talk free movement. Now, there's not a great deal that we can actually say about this, but what we can say is that the government is saying end free movement, giving the UK back control over how many people enter the country. So free movement is technically ending, and Theresa May was in the Commons today reaffirming that point. We are leaving the free movement. There will be no more free movement in the UK, but instead she's proposing a mobility framework so that the UK and EU citizens can continue to travel to each other's territories and apply for study and work. So obviously they're trying to set up some system here whereby people from Europe have it easier to get into the UK. So no free movement, but there's a mobility framework that makes it easier. It sounds like the whole system's just been renamed. And in all honesty, we don't know what this means. We genuinely don't know, because this is politician talk. We kind of have to either wait until Theresa May gives us more details on how it works, if she ever will, or we just have to wait and see what happens if this deal actually goes through. But we can talk more substantively about the customs issue. So this is what the government says about customs. They say the UK and the EU would work together on the phased introduction of a new facilitated customs arrangement that would remove the need for customs checks and controls between the UK and the EU as if a combined customs territory. So here's the Brexiteers' argument against the customs union. Very briefly, it's a system basically that protects European industries that don't really affect the UK. And Matthew Lynn expertly summed this up in The Spectator in April last year, and he explained that in 2016 the customs union increased tariffs on citrus fruits from 3% to 16%, but the UK grows so few oranges and lemons that it just meant that we had to pay more. So tariffs are imposed on the products that we purchase, but if we're outside the customs union, we can set our own tariffs or even remove them if we want and set up free trade deals on our own. And here's what Theresa May's now proposing instead. It appears to be kind of a compromise, potentially to solve the Northern Ireland border issue. The system, if the EU even accepts it, by the way, because let's not forget the EU might look at this and go, nah, we want something better. And they almost certainly will, because we know that a no deal has been pretty much ruled out at this point. But the new system would use new technology that would track the movement, physically track the movement of goods, and determine where they're going and if they're subject to tariffs. This means that imported goods would have UK set tariffs, but goods travelling to EU members, they'd get an EU tariff, and that money, the charges are given to Brussels. Now here's the problem with that. We want to sign free trade deals outside of Europe, and if we're still stuck with all the EU level tariffs, then it makes agreeing to fair deals with other parts of the world much, much harder. And now we can move on to law. In this paper, the government says, ensure that in the future all laws in the UK will be legislated for by Parliament and the devolved administrations and subject to proper oversight and scrutiny. So in regular English, this means that Parliament can have oversight whenever we adopt EU regulations into law. So this means that the EU still writes the rules, but we just have to decide if we want them or not. And let's be honest, historically, the EU tells us to jump and the UK asks how high. So how likely is it that we're not going to take on new EU regulations, especially when these deals, this Brexit negotiation's been so tough? The EU's been punishing us, making it as difficult as possible. And am I to believe that the government or our politicians would say no to EU regulations after we've had such a difficult Brexit negotiation process? It just shows how weak the government is. And David Davis resigned over this issue. He said that for all intents and purposes, it means the UK has the same rules as the EU. And he's right. So number 4, the final bit that I wanted to translate for you, is the Common Rulebook. You've probably heard of this. And the government paper says, the UK and the EU would maintain a common rulebook for all goods, including agri-food, with the UK making an upfront choice to commit by treaty to ongoing harmonisation with EU rules on goods, covering only those necessary to provide for frictionless trade at the border. Basically, all this means is that the UK is going to just stay aligned with EU regulations and maintain, wait for this, harmonisation, great politician word, with all of their rules. So we technically haven't escaped EU regulations at all. And MPs will technically have the final say on whether these rules are changed, but if we change them, will the deal with the EU change? And will the MPs ever vote against them anyway? I mean, this could also affect future trade deals with America. If we've got common rules with the EU, for instance, then we can't accept the same standards as America and forge our own deals with them. A good example of this is chlorinated chicken. You might not want chlorinated chicken, but all sorts of things are chlorinated, if I'm honest. I mean, water and actually salads and all sorts of stuff like that. So, I mean, it's a good example, but it's not the key one. So just bear with me on this. So if we don't allow for chlorinated chicken, which is a EU regulation, then it means that we can't strike a deal with America on trade of chickens. And it's only one of a million different things, but it's a good example because chlorinated chicken is banned in the EU. So if we have to accept these regulations in the EU, which it looks like we will, it's going to make it infinitely more difficult to strike up trade deals with America. So these 4 things are really just 4 striking parts of this document that I think you should know about. And it's always funny with politicians, you know, they want to make it look like they're working in your best interest, but they release documents that make no sense to most people, and they don't even attempt to clarify it when they're on the television. So make no mistake, this is Brexit in name only. The Chequers plan is Brexit in name only. Ministers have resigned over this, and for good reason. I suspect more ministers are going to be resigning later on in the day. And not only does this mean that we're going to have all the same rules as the EU, because we know that the politicians are cowards and will never vote to change the rules, and not only does this mean that it's going to be infinitely more difficult to strike trade deals with the rest of the world, but it means, as David Davis says, we've given too much away far too easily. Theresa May is a snake in the grass. She told us that Brexit means Brexit, but she never meant it all along. And while she tries to pass off this deal to the public as a real Brexit deal, and while she's struggling with Brexiteer MPs in her own party, she's schmoozing with Labour, SNP and Lib Dem MPs to try and pass this through the back door. If you want to see more from me and the rest of the Rebel team, remember to like and subscribe.